Good afternoon. Everybody hear me all right? Great. We are discussing today adoption of open source models in large enterprises, so let's dive straight into it. First question to Emad. Enterprises are always in a rush to do things, Emad. When adopting for enterprises, what's open source really good at, and what areas are you seeing the greatest upside of using open source?
Yeah, I think that we've had these research artifacts that have suddenly gone into enterprise, and where we saw the biggest uptake on enterprise is where they need to have that customization on the image models, for example, but also language, and then also optimize for expense and speed. So typically, the open source models tend to be smaller, more agile, and they bring the private data, and then they deploy it. This is why we deployed to Amazon Bedrock and other things, and we saw people running it locally as well as on other services.
Sean, Sahara is all about decentralizing AI. You have really big name customers already. What are enterprises thinking about when weighing open source versus closed source?
Yeah, I think the main sort of a decision on when enterprise selecting the service is like basically the cost and then also the performance of the model. And on that front, I think for now, we are seeing that even though open source models are catching up the gap with the closed source model, the top ones, but closed source models still have about 1 to 2 years advantage of in terms of the performance. And they also are really good at pushing the model size to be smaller so that the cost and the inference speed to be faster. So I think they are sort of leaning a little bit more towards building on closed source models, but open source models become much more competitive these days.
Vipul, you've built together in a really interesting way. Enterprises come to use the compute and then have a choice between open and closed. What is the thinking behind how you've set it up?
I think one of the things we think about is generative AI is a computationally expensive technology, and we've had availability issues on this compute. So we built a platform from the ground up. We built data centers, compute layers, efficiency software, and then we orchestrate various models. We put a lot of focus on open source models. You can think of large frontier model labs are building developer platforms around their models. We've built a developer platform and a production platform, really, around open source models. We have 200 open source models today on this. And one of the things that we are seeing repeatedly, that one, open models are getting really good. The gap between open and closed is really closing, and there's a better sort of, the gradient of change is quite sharp. And as enterprises are deploying this, especially companies that have tens or hundreds of millions of users, multiple use cases, they really care about price performance. And this is, I think, a place where open source really shines.
Great. Vivek, you started Sarvam to deploy open source in Indian languages to make it more affordable, efficient. How do enterprises manage the customization and the skills that are required typically for open source?
Right. I think, in fact, one of the benefits, and in India is certainly a country where cost is very, very important. So I think open source models, starting from open source models is good. And starting from small models is good, right? Many of the enterprise use cases are actually more constrained in the domain in which they're being used. So therefore, actually, the benefits of both the cost being less and being able to customize for things that are relevant to us, right? I think that's the ability to customize and the cost. And I think that's what has been the consensus here, is really what drives people to use, at least start from these models and deploy things.
Emad, backstage, we were talking briefly about your new venture, and as it relates to open source and closed source, I would love for you to talk about it a little bit more. You've been described, Emad, as Mr. Anti-OpenAI, so you want to be the leader of all kinds of open. I just wonder, your new venture, could you describe the thought process behind it and how do you think that's going to go forward?
Well, I think that what we saw was we managed to keep up on the open source side, on the compute and others. Like Stability are running over 10,000 A100s, but now you're seeing hundreds of thousands of H100s coming on the proprietary side. We're thankful to Meta and the open sourcing of Llama, but we don't know if that'll continue, and they themselves have said, maybe not on 400B, etc. So with the new venture, I kind of looked at Bitcoin and the provisioning of energy using 160 terawatt hours, double that of generative AI for compute. I was like, what if we just made a Bitcoin for AI? And then we use that to coordinate compute for open source, to support open source entities building national, healthcare, education, and more. I think that has to be open. And I don't think it's closed versus open. I think they're both complementary. Open models will always trail closed models because you can bring private data to them. But it's like, will you hire your own graduates or will you get a consultant? And a lot of times you will need that consultant that is more specialized. A lot of times you'll want that graduate that you need yourself. But we must have that option. Otherwise, enterprises, individuals, and others, you won't have AI that truly represents you, and you're beholden on a systems and decision-making process to powers outside your control.
Sean, one of the things about open source models is about, how a lot of this can be used for malicious activities, whether by the state or by individual actors, and create really disinformation on a really population scale. And so when you're talking about open source models, how do you balance safety with accessibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the open source model, which technically speaking means that the whole model weights, the parameters are exposed to all of the users, which basically give a much broader opportunities for the suspicious users and attackers to play with it, because a lot of data poisoning methods and inference time sort of a backdoor attack methods, they are working well because they can use the weights of the model to do a lot of tweaking and design. So basically, open source model expose all of itself to give more chances for the attacker to deal with it compared to the closed source model, which is kind of like a downside of it, right? And that's why when OpenAI are exposing its APIs, it actually have a very careful design on what parts of the APIs allows people to use. For example, you might not be able to access all of the logics of a token decoded on a certain position. You only can see the top 5 or top 3. And then you can add biases to the logics, but you cannot do too much about it. There's a paper showing that with such constraint, you have to spend 100 times more compute in order to expose certain part of the model. So I think that's, there's reasons behind that. They want to have some API protections of this model. But I think if you put it on my faculty hat and just think about open science, I think I just love to have this entirely open source model, which give the researchers all of the opportunity to look into different parts of the model development process and build better things on top of it. Yeah.
Vipul, some of the geopolitical tension of our times has somehow managed to creep into the open sourced, closed source debate. And I just wonder, it is a bipolar world. I just wonder, what do you say about that argument that open source lets people get to date with technology that, should be, some countries think it should be sort of protected.
I think building these models is, at some level, fairly basic calculus. It's math. And imagining that restricting access to that is a good strategy for it's a good geopolitical strategy, I think is, in my mind, sort of mistaken, because it will get, if there is that much value, that it is a geopolitical force, I think most countries will be able to really kind of spend that much value to build these models. So I think the other side of this is immense value from having these open artifacts that researchers around the world, companies around the world can build on these, can do innovative work on it. So I think it's a lot to give up. I sort of think about, programming languages, general purpose programming languages. We could write malware with it, and in fact, people did. But restricting them would have been just, a gargantuan mistake in some ways, and the digital world that we have today is a result of that. So I think there's always multiple sides to this, but this is one of the most transformative, important technologies of our time, and we really should distribute it as widely as possible.
This is such an important question that I feel like I should go around the room with it. Sean, do you feel like, what do you think about, all of the arguments versus, closed versus open that are used in a very geopolitical, to make geopolitical arguments?
Yeah, I think there's two parts of the question, right? So first, I want to comment a little bit on the open versus closed source, because I'm not a full supporter of entire open source community. I think that it just there's a problem that if every single data contributors, like people who are putting content into Reddit, Twitter, and Wikipedia and GitHub, and all of this data then was used to upgrade the next generation of GPT model, say GPT-5, which is going to be 3-4 times better than GPT-4, then the model can start just replacing more people's job, automate more parts of humans' life, without properly attributing the profit and revenue back to the data contributor who own the proprietary knowledge, their personal preferences. And this gap will only be larger with the current economic system. Because of lack of the attribution and provenance mechanisms in the Web2 infrastructure. So I think the problem has to be resolved with just disrupted technology. For example, within Sahara AI, we're building this on-chain attribution and provenance, which is just one part of the effort trying to resolve the problem. But I do think that foundational models, which are capturing human common sense knowledge, war knowledge, basic language processing abilities, should be open source. Because it is just public goods that everyone, including researchers and industry, engineers should build on top of it to make it generally better. But then every single person like you and me, when we try to integrate our personal information, like our financial report, health reports, emails, text messages, with these models to build a better version of our digital twin, our personal replica, and try to monetize that through automating part of our business process, I think that part should be closed source, because that's our information gap to the other people, and I can continue to use that to monetize whatever my business model that has been established. Yeah.
Emad?
Yeah, well, I think that, again, I think they're complementary, the two. On the geopolitical side, we've seen discussions about AI safety, where first of all, AI GI is going to kill us all. And now it's China will get the AI first, and it's a danger to have that. I think these are all canards, because AI comes in a wide variety of things, but ultimately it's amplified intelligence at the moment. You're using it to do a job. I think this is what's important in global enterprise. It's like we had the first level programming, now we're putting the building blocks together, and then we have to deploy. But you will find, for example, in every regulated industry, I believe every government will insist that data is open, in that you need to know what feeds the model, because you can poison the models, and we're already seeing that. Anthropic had their sleeper agent paper. You put a few thousand words into a model, and then you can turn it evil with a prompt, and you can't tune it out. You need to know what goes inside these models for enterprise decision-making use cases. The code is already pretty open. We know what it kind of is. And then it's a function of you do the work to actually build the model. Do you release the model weights freely? Well, I think that does help with science and security, but there is also a role for keeping it private. And again, if we have data transparency in particular, I think that solves many of the issues around alignment, safety, geopolitics, and more.
Vivek?
No, I think that it's not an either-or thing. I think both open source as well as closed source have their role to play. I think that a lot of the progress that we've made in AI in the last decade is open source has had a very, very important role in there. So I think it's something that got us here. I think will continue to have a role to play. And I think that, as someone said, that the fact that, the reason why suddenly people are talking about it is because the kinds of things these models can do are pretty amazing. And then, and I think that actually leads to an existence proof. If somebody's actually done it, then somebody else can do it. I mean, I think that just not having it open source is not going to stop someone else from doing it. Right? I think that's, I think at least in much of human endeavor, I think that when you see that someone else has done it, it actually makes it much easier to do. And so therefore, but I think that, as I said, that I think there is definitely a role to play for closed source models as well. And I think that we will have that dance of both of these things happening. There will always be a certain, when something's more important, there will be an open source thing, that representative that will be there.
Vivek, now back to you about a question on affordability. I know that a lot of these companies are raising billions of dollars at mind-boggling valuations, which means that they have the money to spend and will, eventually have to charge the users. I wonder how you're looking at affordability in a country like India, or even other markets that I'm sure you'll eventually target. You talked, I know, about a minute of a voice-to-voice AI costing as low as 12 cents. Can you talk a little bit about that?
See, I think what we see is that when you look at a country like India, I think one of the things that we said is that how do we look at it as an access problem, right? We want 1 billion people to actually use these technologies in ways that make sense for them, and in ways that and for that, I think a couple of things that we realized is that, I think the interactions have to be through voice. That's really fundamentally, if you look at, that's the natural way for people to interact with these models. And the second thing, of course, is that the cost is a big deal. So that's why we are indexing on having relatively small models that are low cost, low latency, and are able to do this at that scale. And I think over time, those costs are going to come down, and that's really that at least that there is people can actually use at a very large scale Gen AI to actually get things done, and that's the mission statement. It's really not what the model is or what anything else is can people access this to make their lives better at a scale that has never been imagined before.
Sean, I was tracking Meera Murati, the CTO of OpenAI, a couple of weeks ago, talking at another AI conference, those seem to be in fashion now, in the same city. And I heard her say that the economic impact of generative AI is just beginning to show. So I want to ask you, is it too early for enterprises to actually think about monetization when using, deploying some of these technologies?
I actually think enterprise is probably one of the first group of people that are thinking about monetizing AI, right? I mean, the investors are pretty realistic these days in Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, and all over the globe, that they will first ask what's your business model and what's your go-to-market, and how you're going to justify this valuation with your revenue and your margin, stuff like that. So I think they are the sort of the harshest people that first ask this batch of question. But the problem here is foundational model and the sort of the surrounding ecosystem infrastructure is not going to have the go-to-market as fast as the application or AI application sort of cohort, right? Because they don't have a clear established business model like what these applications already have, where they just need to plug in AI to automate part of the process to give better user experiences, mostly about increasing productivity, reducing the time of the existing business process. Versus foundational model was designed to be generalist. Basically means they're supposed to solve every part of the language problem, the perception problem, have the war model, have the common ground, become a good personal sort of mental model in the very ultimate goal. So I think that's a much more far-reaching stage that which it's really hard to translate to the valuation that this company have. But apparently, we also don't need that many companies building foundational model that consume so much GPU compute, which translate to the electricity power that's out there, which can be used to do better things out there. So it's kind of really nuanced right now, but I think the whole market is getting more conscious about how to spend the money on this AI development process.
What are the conversations like, Vipul, when you're talking to your customers? I mean, how much are they talking about return on investment?
I think we've definitely seen that for certain features which are to be deployed to your entire user base, there's a cost threshold. After above that threshold, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't sort of. So I think companies are thinking about the ROI fairly carefully, given it's a new the computational cost is big. And what we are finding is by adopting these generative AI features, companies are able to make certain things like their customer service just a much broader product than it was before, and that's opening up new opportunities, being able to support new kinds of things because now they can support it for their customers widely. So I think it's always really there, maybe not so much in the POC stage, but definitely in the deployment stage.
Is it a lot of POCs right now? I mean, when I talk to enterprises, I see that they have like 70 POCs going on at the same time, but very little actual deployment.
I think there's it's a gradient, but we're seeing consumer tech companies really deploy this in production features a lot more this year than compared to last year.
Emad, on a different track, I feel like this is a question that I should ask you. When you look at closed source models and proprietary AI systems, there are 3 or 4 names that keep popping up again and again. And I feel like, is that kind of power aggregation worrisome?
Well, I think it's very worrisome when you've got technology that can be used for fundamental decision-making processes, because we outsource a surprising amount of our minds to these models. I think as well, as you kind of look at it, we all saw not Scarlett Johansson's voice, as it were. These models are very, very persuasive. And we have to remember that 2 of the biggest AI model providers are on the proprietary side of Google and Meta, and their business is advertising, which is effectively manipulation. And so what happens if they want to go full tilt and have manipulative voices that are doing that? So I think there needs to be a real look at the regulation of that, the power concentration. This is why the FTC and others are looking. But having a vibrant, open ecosystem benefits that. Again, Meta have done that with Llama because it benefits their overall business. If their language model is 10% more efficient, then they can serve 10% more customers or have 10% lower cost. And the open ecosystem enables that, right? So I think that we have to definitely be very careful, but we also see it from the single point of failure. OpenAI's API went down a little while ago, and all of these chatbots that apparently didn't use OpenAI stopped working. Even, I think, yesterday, I think one of them, again, it was OpenAI that went down, but then suddenly Claude went down as well. The reason for that, it seemed, was because there was too much traffic being diverted. And when you're looking at an enterprise setting, you need to have resilience, you need to have backup and others, and so we have to make sure we don't have too much concentration risk on business-critical logic or society-critical logic.
Yeah. Sean, when you're looking at funding, I mean, all of you at this table on this panel are experienced, I should say, veterans at fundraising. Do you feel like there is that distinct leaning towards proprietary models that you don't, I mean, for instance, Vivek has raised sub-100 million, all of you have raised tens of millions of dollars at least. I just wonder, is there like investors, when they look at open source, closed source, Is there a leaning towards proprietary models, Sean, do you think?
I think so. I mean, again, this goes back to the business model and go-to-market, right? For an open source model that we are seeing here, I don't think it's the model that really become the source of the revenue. It is the whole ecosystem, the infrastructure that pull together the user actions where you can translate them into something that you can turn into revenue. It's an indirect process versus a proprietary model if it's a huge advantage in a certain vertical domain to GPT-4, for example, to Llama 3. And then people will love to use it by paying the premium of the capability that model brings on top of GPT-4, right? So I think this is two very different tactics for go-to-market versus, for example, we've seen very nice projects like LangChain and things like Chatbot Arena from LM6. They are building also some sort of open source resources, including data sets and some smaller models, but they don't really monetize through those. They monetize through finding the users to something else that they can serve value.
Vipul, responsible open source, how can one expand trust with it? It's a really important question that came to me on one of my social networks, and I feel like I want to go around the room with that question, starting with you, Vipul.
I would say open source really kind of gives us an opportunity to study these models. The amount of transparency that you have with open models is just significantly higher than a model behind an API. And if you look at a lot of the guardrails research, the red teaming research that's coming out, it's all built around open models because this is what researchers have access to. I think increasingly, we will find that safety techniques that were created around these artifacts are the techniques that are just making their way into the entire ecosystem.
Vivek?
I tend to agree. The fact that the fact these models are open has much more scrutiny, much more research is done on how to build guardrails, how to work these things out. So while certainly it is easier to do things because they are open, but at the same time that's also spurring. Having these models being open is probably spurring research into how to protect against these things better.
Emad?
I think that having high-quality open models reduces risk because the reality is that the cost of building good models, not great models, is reducing rapidly. So with Stable Diffusion, the original one, it probably cost about $4 million of research and then about $300,000-400,000 to train that model. With the next generation NVIDIA chips coming on next year, a model equivalent to that performance will probably cost $10,000. So anyone can build it. But if you look at SDXL, for example, we made it so it was very difficult to generate nudity and bad concepts and other things. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction. Similarly, if you look at something like Llama 3 on the instruct-tuned version, it's actually quite difficult to get it to do bad things. It's still possible with lots of effort. But the reality is a Llama 3 model, I think people around here would say, would you be surprised if that costs less than $100,000 3 or 4 years from now? Yeah. Yes. So by providing good quality models, people won't train other ones, and you can embed good standards in it, and you can be critiqued. That's why I think open data sets are important, open models are important. I think we're safer that way. And also that we know what they're capable of, which I think is the other part. We still actually really know what the super advanced models are capable of. And the RAND Corporation had a recent piece about how we can secure that. OpenAI just had a blog about that. Because the operational security in these places is terrible. So we must assume the state-level bad actors have it already.
Sean?
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit different takes on this one. So I think there's two, on this current open source competitions with the closed source, there's actually two types of open source model companies. One type of them is trying to just like disrupt the market by just throwing really good, capable open source model. But these companies, for example, Meta, they really have well-established business process and monetization channels that they don't care about if they are spending tens of millions of dollars on this kind of GPT 3.5 level kind of a model, like Llama 3, for example, where they can just like showcase to, hey, you can actually get free to similar capability. You don't have bother to upload your personal data to use OpenAI's APIs, right? Just make the market really like noisy and nuances. But there's also a group of companies are really doing hard work. I would say including, Mistral in its earlier years maybe, and also Cohere, I want to call out, and a bunch of other companies that really have this like open science mindsets when starting a company, and the community like it, give it money to really give it a try. I'm honestly a little bit worried about their sort of a business model and go to market down the road. I don't know. I think they're gonna somehow maybe have to keep a version of their model, the strongest version of it, to be proprietary so that they can do some enterprise-facing go-to-market. But still, they are doing the whole things for open science group view.
One of the questions, whether open or closed, one of the questions is the cost of compute. And as compute costs rise, energy costs rise, and there is actually going to be a point reached at some near time in the future where there is just not going to be enough energy to support AI models and systems. I just wonder, where you think that's leading to Vipul.
One of the big focuses for us at Together is building more efficient model architectures, building more efficient techniques so we can extract more value out of the chips that exist today. So we build everything from attention frameworks to subquadratic models. I think we'll see a lot of work in this direction because even if we have more abundance in compute, the amount of number of use cases and amount of usage is growing. So we really need to focus on how to make these things more efficient. That's going to be pretty key.
Vivek?
I'm actually quite optimistic about it. I think that models have, while models have grown bigger, models have become much more efficient even in the last year. Various things are going to run on the edge. I think some of those things are going to begin to happen. So I think sometimes these kinds of energy doomsdayers, I don't think it'll come to pass in that direction. I mean, I don't know the answers about how all of these things are going to work. And also the fact that you don't need the largest models to do most things that are useful, right? And I think that a combination of all of those things, while certainly the usage of these models is going to increase by orders of magnitude, I do not see a corresponding energy usage that rises as a result of that. And I think we'll find answers to some of these questions.
Yeah. Actually, there are so many startups that are trying to crack that problem from different directions.
Yes.
Emad, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that you have a division between frontier models that require incredibly large clusters, and we're getting into from thousands to millions of GPUs in these clusters over the next few years, requiring gigawatts of electricity potentially, to models that just work everywhere. And I think what you're seeing is a level of satisficing, where a model is good enough to do a job. So I said that I think that Stable Diffusion 3 that releases next week is probably the last great image model. Like, will there be improvements and optimizations? Yes. But you don't need much more than that, particularly when you combine it with a system like Comfy UI. Do you need more than GPT-4 level performance on your MacBook or in Indian or anything like that? No. So I think you hit that model performance level and then you optimize, and 90% of the stuff in the models is rubbish, or you can train for longer, for example, once, and then the inference is lower. But I think there will still be demand for these frontier models for the most advanced stuff, and for the political stuff, and for the competition stuff as well. So I think energy usage will be a real issue.
Sean?
Yeah, I think one thing is pretty clear is the knowledge distillation is working pretty well so far. All of the models that was distilled from GPT-4 seems to be on par with GPT 3.5, which is great news. When GPT-5 drops, we probably will have 8 billion model or even smaller model that is on par with GPT-4. I think that's good news for everyone. But the first principle of scale, which is the scaling law, hasn't changed yet. So I think, for example, Sam Altman probably will still be chasing bigger model, more compute until he see a limit or clear sign of limit. But again, we don't need so many foundational model companies. We just probably need a couple ones of them, keep pushing the boundary and see if there's breakthroughs to us.
One-word answers. If you were an enterprise user, Vipul, would you go open or closed?
Open, yes.
Vivek?
Both.
Imad?
Open.
I'm a semi-open. So open foundational model, closed personal models.
Yeah, agile.
Yeah, agile.
Amazing. Sean, Imad, Vivek, and Vipul, thank you so much for your insights. And audience, let's hear a huge round of applause for our awesome panel. Thank you.